This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics, the Thinking Tree series, a platform where we invite intellectuals and professionals to share their ideas on various economics aspects and issues. Today, the theme for our discussion is intellectual property rights. And we have a very special guest today, Professor Dean Baker, who is a senior economist and who co founded the Center for Economic Policy and Research in the year 1999. His areas of research and expertise include housing and macroeconomics, intellectual property, social security, Medicare, and European labor markets. A very warm welcome to on our show, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on. I look forward to the discussion.
To begin with, sir, what is the relationship between economic development and intellectual property? And is the current global regime of intellectual property rights adequate in serving the purpose of economic development and welfare?
Well, the history of economic development and intellectual property rights is actually a very interesting one because it's often, I'm speaking from someone in the United States, it's often treated as though patents and copyrights in their current form were always with us and always respected and all good people appreciated them. And that's entirely not true. You could probably say for every country, but I know the experience of the United States best being living here. We often did not respect other countries' intellectual property rights. And there's sort of some interesting stories here. When we first began to industrialize at the beginning of the 19th century, England had an industrial secrets law which prohibited the export of what they considered industrial secrets, important industrial secrets, most importantly, the steam engine. And there's a great story of how one of our first steam engine centers, textile mills, was actually started by a entrepreneur who arranged to smuggle an engineer who was an expert in steam engines out of England so that he could basically break their claims on intellectual property and design steam mills in the United States. But that continued. I mean, we meaning the United States, did not respect England's copyright laws until well into the 19th century. Dickens, a great English author, he was infuriated that his work, it would be coming out in England and at the same time it would come out in the United States, and he wasn't getting any money for it. So, we didn't respect his copyrights. I think it wasn't until the 1870s that we finally signed an agreement with England where we agreed to respect their copyrights. Similar stories with patents. There's been some new research. In World War I, of course, the United States was at war with Germany, and one of our ways to retaliate was that we said we would not respect their patents. And Germany at that time was really at the forefront in chemical engineering. And apparently there was a real boom. I'm saying this based on some recent research. There's a real boom in chemicals in the United States because we suddenly had access to all this great German technology that they could use freely. So the idea that you should always have patents and copyrights, that all these ideas should be protected by intellectual property, we haven't always adhered to that. Now, what's happened in the last, say, 3 or 4 decades is the United States internally has made its patent and copyrights longer and stronger. I won't go into great detail there, but you could patent things like life forms that you used to not be able to patent. So we've extended patents to new areas, we've made them longer, we've made them stronger. And we've also sought to impose them internationally, most importantly, the TRIPS provisions of the WTO. So basically that requires all WTO members to adopt US-type patent law with some variations, but again, US-type patent law. And we also have very strong rules on copyright, again, applying that to the developing world. And then when we sign bilateral trade agreements, or sometimes multilateral, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Donald Trump pulled the US out of that, but we were the big pusher on that. They actually have even stronger rules. And from the standpoint of the developing world, this is an enormous impediment to their development because basically the story with knowledge that everyone should know, it's free. I mean, it's knowledge. The idea of intellectual property is sort of a strange notion because it's non-exclusive. So if you have a house and I go, oh, that's a really nice house, I'd like to be able to use it. Well, I mean, we can negotiate something, but I can't just move in. I'd have to push you out, right? It's exclusive. But the difference with intellectual property, you invent some great new drug, you have some new software. My using that does not affect at all your ability to use it. It might affect your ability to profit from it because you want to sell it to me, but it's non-exclusive. So the idea that we would make all this knowledge exclusive and charge for its use, that's, I shouldn't say an odd notion, but the point is that's very much a policy that could be altered. And the way we structured both national and international intellectual property law is very much to the detriment to developing countries, because all of this knowledge that could otherwise be available for free to them is now very expensive. And again, just referring back to what I was saying earlier with the United States, that wasn't our own history. We were prepared to violate intellectual property laws, other countries, of course, but we were prepared to violate intellectual property laws in ways that foster our own development and economic growth, but we want to deny that opportunity to developing countries.
Yes, it was earlier like the knowledge and the awareness was also less. We can also say that, like, that is why the violation was there. True, sir. I was reading a fascinating quote in your paper. So I read that in the paper called Innovation, Intellectual Property and Development, written jointly by you, Professor Arjun Dev, and Professor Joseph Stiglitz, stating that by the standards of today's global rules, every advanced industrialized country would have been classified as an intellectual property violator at the early stages of development when they freely used ideas and technologies generated elsewhere. Could you enlighten us by this?
Yeah, so the story I was telling you for the United States, I, of course, know the U.S. history best, but you could tell similar stories with pretty much every country. Again, I can't speak in great detail about, say, the history of some of the countries, but the history of countries developing by, in essence, freely using the innovations of other countries. That was the story in France. It was the story in Germany. It was perhaps less so UK, just because they were the first, so there was less for them to get from other countries. Although there's still instances there where they definitely used innovations from France and other countries without, say, their authorization. So the idea that somehow, again, that what we have in place today as intellectual property law was always there, that's simply not true. So again, we're applying rules today to developing countries that were not there when the US, Europe, Japan, when they were developing. And had those rules been there, it almost certainly would have been a serious impediment to their development and growth. So it was, a good thing for those countries, and I would say a good thing for the world, that those rules were not tightly enforced at the time.
True. On the similar lines, now let's talk about the major innovation that everyone in the world is craving for, the vaccine for COVID-19. In the early days of the pandemic, it was observed that there was a large degree of international cooperation with scientists around the world, quickly sharing new findings. However, that has kept waning. Why do you think cooperative research is so hard to perform, even in the sense of economics?
Yeah, well, this is kind of fascinating. I'm saying this very much as an outsider, so I'm not a biochemist, I'm not a researcher, so I'm just reading some of the literature, discussing this in the scientific community. And the stories they were saying is that in the early days, in January, February, March, when scientists understood this is this horrible pandemic that's infecting the whole world, killing, well, now millions of people, but at that point, tens of thousands. And they had to do everything they could to try to figure out ways to deal with it. And there was widespread collaboration. Basically, what people were doing is they were doing their experiments, they were having their findings, and they were posting them immediately on the web, because there was no idea that, oh, we're going to try to profit from that. The idea was, okay, we're going to post this so that it could be shared. Our colleagues in other countries or elsewhere in this country, in the United States, they could look at it, they could criticize it, they could point out if it's wrong, they could build on it if it's right. And they were able to make very quick progress in the early days of the pandemic. But quickly you turn to a race to develop specific treatments, therapies, and of course a vaccine. And that was very much then privatized with the idea that, okay, we're going to develop, we meaning specific countries, the United States, of course, first and foremost here, not saying that just as a person in the United States, but obviously we're the biggest country acting on this, that we're going to develop a vaccine and we're then going to have ownership of it. So we're going to have intellectual property rights and presumably use it for our own populations first, and then other countries as we see fit, whether they buy it from us or we give it out as aid, whatever it might be. And what that meant was that it slowed down the process. And we've seen this very, very, I don't know if interesting is exactly the right word here, but this story where you've had countries in effect competing, and it looks to be the case that China, with its vaccines, is at the forefront. They've pursued a number of different vaccines, as has the United States, as has Europe, as have other countries, but they pursued a number of different formats. But what seems to have advanced most quickly is an old-fashioned dead virus format. So the oldest vaccines were dead viruses, and it turned out that could be effective against many diseases, which, you need an effective vaccine first and foremost. It doesn't have to be the most modern. So our companies were pursuing mostly RMNA technologies, a new technology, which, as I understand, holds tremendous promise. But the point is, it's not a well-developed technology. The dead virus vaccine was a very well-developed technology. So as a result of pursuing that route, China scientists were able to do their testing more quickly and get into the field with large-scale clinical testing, the phase 3 test that ultimately determined its effectiveness and whether it could be approved as a good vaccine and widely distributed. Now, if you had continued with the collaborative route, you would have it so that as soon as it became clear that China had a promising dead virus vaccine, then the United States, Europe, India, whoever would be able to jump on that and go, well, that's fantastic. We'll do our own testing with it. I mean, we'll still learn from China's tests, but we'll do our own testing. And if that's going to be available, if that's the first thing available, then great, we could all use it. We'll all distribute it. Anyone who could manufacture it is able to manufacture it. And we would be much, much further along. Again, going by, what's being said, what China's saying, its government and its scientists, it seems that a vaccine from China might well be available for approval early next month. And you might see large-scale distribution in China and perhaps in some other countries as early as December. And you just think, knowing how much we're seeing this second wave, certainly in Europe and the United States. I think in India it's actually going down a little bit, but in Europe and the United States, we're seeing record levels of infection. So the idea that we might as early as December be able to start giving a vaccine to those most vulnerable and to send to the frontline workers, the healthcare workers who are exposed, that would have been enormous benefit. And as it stands, we'll be very, very lucky if we get there in January, and it might well be February, even later. So we could have gained enormously from having collaborative research in the development process of a vaccine itself. And instead, we went this, to my view, very foolish route that, both, privatizing and also, in Donald Trump's case, very much nationalizing it. Had to be America first, which, just adds another layer, to my mind, foolishness.
It's true. Because it's a crisis against humanity, not just a particular country. So if we collaborate, we'll be able to utilize the small amount of time that we have so we can stop the spread of it.
There's so much reason why. I mean, I would argue in general, we want biomedical research to be collaborative, but there was so much reason in this particular case to do it because we face such an urgent threat. I mean, we could say things like cancer, AIDS, all these things kill people, but in this case, we're talking about such a large number, and obviously it's a very contagious disease. So stopping it everywhere is to all our benefit, because as long as one country has it, it's going to be a threat to us all.
Yes, because in the globalization era, we can have a threat of spreading it again. Yes. Many items that sell at high prices as a result of patent or copyright protection would be free or nearly free in the absence of these government-granted monopolies. In this context, do the intellectual property rights do more harm than good to an economy?
Well, I would argue they very much do, and drugs really drive that home more than anywhere, because and the United States, of course, well, the United States and India are a great contrast, because the United States, we have patent protected prices and no control. So we're really distinct that way. So obviously they have patents in Canada and Europe, other countries, but they have some control on drug prices. They don't just give a company a monopoly and say charge whatever you feel like. Whereas in India, of course, you have the world's far and away leading generic drug industry. So we see some amazing contrast. I know Savati, the hepatitis C drug, great breakthrough drug. It actually cured hepatitis C, which is a debilitating and potentially deadly disease. They were charging $84,000 for a 3-month dosage in the United States when it first came out. It's down somewhat because there's some competition and whatever, but that was the original price. You could get the generic version in India for a few $100s. So you see these sorts of incredible price differentials. And the point is simply that in almost all cases, these drugs are very cheap to manufacture and distribute. So when you see these incredible prices, and again, I'm referring to the United States, so something like Savati, the hepatitis drug, might have been $30,000 in Europe because they have controls, but still, hugely more than the generic price. In almost all cases, these high prices are simply due to the patent protection. And again, I'm not naive about this. You have to pay the researchers. I get paid for a living, so you have to pay the researchers. But my argument is we could pay them up front. And we do that to some extent. The United States spends over $40 billion a year on biomedical research, primarily through our National Institutes of Health, but we have several other agencies that, spend $1 billion here, $1 billion there. I mean, for the US, that's not much. But in any case, we spend over $40 billion a year paying people directly upfront for research. So they're not dependent on patent monopolies. If we were to say double or triple that, we could replace the patent-supported research. And what that would mean is all the research would be in the public domain. So people develop a drug, do their test on it. All of that would be fully public, which has several major advantages. One is, of course, science advances most quickly when it's open. So people could build on the successes, learn from the failures. So we would, to my view, I suspect, see much more rapid development of drugs, useful drugs. But another aspect of that I think would be enormously beneficial, apart from just having drugs be cheap, is you would remove the perverse incentives that patents create. And it's one of the strange things to me as an economist that when I raise this, economists always look at me blank-faced. You go, look, patents give drug companies incentive. Go, right? You can't really argue that. Of course they do. That's the whole point. We give them a patent monopoly, they charge a high price, gives them incentive to innovate. But it also gives them incentive to do bad things. So in the United States, we have an enormous opioid crisis. There was a new generation of opioids, painkillers, that were developed in the 1990s. And the companies that developed them said, oh, these are great because they're not addictive. So opioids have long been known to be addictive, so this wasn't, so this was going to be a great breakthrough. Here's this new generation, and they claimed they were not addictive. Now, it turns out they are highly addictive. And it turns out the drug companies knew that. And they concealed the evidence that was addictive so that they could sell their drugs as widely as possible. So you go, well, why did they do that? Well, of course, because they had patent monopolies and they could sell them for a high price. If they were selling them as generics where, you pay $10, $15 for a prescription, well, they'd make money on that, but they wouldn't have incentive to go out and lie and risk, actually I should say kill, because many, tens of thousands have died as a result of opioid addiction. So they wouldn't have had that incentive. And you see that all the time. I mean, that's a really dramatic, extraordinary case. But you see it all the time in the United States that a drug company is caught concealing evidence that their drug may not be as effective as they claimed, or in many cases it could actually be harmful. And if we didn't have the patent monopoly, they wouldn't have that incentive. So to my view, again, I think it's clear with prescription drugs. I think patents in general have been abused, copyrights as well. There's all sorts of issues with copyrights that take me forever to go into. But we've had all sorts of abuses. And this is, again, it's 100% predictable in the sense that, again, speaking as an economist, every economist knows I want to put a 20% tariff on steel. And every economist will say, oh, well, that will create all these distortions and it will create incentives for corruption. So you're going to make payoffs to politicians that you could get around the 20% tariff, or you make payoffs to politicians to make it 25% tariff. So there's all sorts of things that they would point to. And I go, okay, now let's talk about patents. But in the case of a patent, we aren't raising the price by 25%. we're often raising the price by 1,000%, sometimes 10,000%. I mean, and again, economists get upset at me when I make those comparisons and go, the market doesn't care that you call it a patent. It has the same impact as 1,000% tariff or 10. It has the same impact. Companies act the same way. And again, I agree. I mean, 20% tariff has problems. Doesn't mean you never want to do it, but it does have problems. But if you say a 20% tariff has problems, how about 1,000%? How about 10? And we have to my view, we have to think of it that way. And when you do, it's hard. Again, first and foremost, in case of prescription drugs, problems in other areas. But in the case of prescription drugs, it's very hard to make the case that this is the best way to finance the research.
Research, yes, sir. Because it's like a trade-off between the promoting the research on the one hand and working market efficiently on the other. So it's like a trade-off. On the same line, sir, one last question. How do you see the post-COVID world with the role of World Trade Organization into protecting the intellectual property rights?
My hope, and this may be more hope than clear thinking, is that there will be some reexamination. I mean, part of the story is that I'm hoping that we'll know in a few days here whether Donald Trump is reelected or whether Joe Biden gets a second term. Basically, Donald Trump's position has been withdraw from the WTO, which in some senses, if Donald Trump is president, may not be a bad thing for the world. But in any case, I expect Joe Biden, of course, would re-engage. And I would hope there would be some clearer thinking on what we want to do with intellectual property. And in this case, I'm really rooting for China's vaccine. Well, for two reasons. One is I want to see people get access to a vaccine as quickly as possible, first and foremost. If that's a U.S. vaccine, fantastic. If it's European, if it's an Indian, if it's Chinese, whatever, but it looks like China's at the forefront. So if their vaccine proves to be safe and effective, and then they could distribute it widely, an advantage to the dead virus approach is that it's easy to distribute. Our vaccines require super cold storage. That's a problem for the U.S. It's a very big problem in the developing world. When I'm saying super cold storage, I mean minus 70 degrees centigrade. So that requires some serious technology. So one is I hope that vaccine spreads widely for that purpose, that people can get it. But the other part is I hope it will lead to some rethinking that, maybe we should have done this differently. Again, I'm not attributing altruism to China. I understand their leaders they're nationalists. They have clear national interest at stake. But on the other hand, if there was a push from the United States, from Europe, from India that we want collaborative research, my guess is that China could be brought along. And I think it would be fantastic if we said, okay, there's some things we could very usefully do collaboratively. Biomedical research, first and foremost. The other thing that comes to mind is climate research. I mean, why shouldn't we all be collaborating on developing solar technology, developing wind technology, developing energy storage mechanisms? That would be an enormous benefit to the world, particularly since the emissions, it doesn't matter whether the emissions come from the US or India or China, it has the same impact on the planet. So if we could make the technology widely available as quickly as possible, we all benefit. So I would hope there'd be some clearer thinking on that. And again, that might be more hope than my own clear thinking, but I guess we'll see soon enough.
So future post-COVID world depends on collaboration. That's a great word, sir. At last, sir, if you have any words of encouragement for Ecoholics, our initiative.
Well, I think it's fantastic to have something like this widely accessible for people to learn, I hope, basic economics. I mean, my view is economists often needlessly make simple things complex. And my view is if you know what you're talking about, you should be able to make complex things simple. And I think that's what you're trying to do here. And getting that to a wide audience is really a very, very important thing.
Thank you so much, sir. It was an honor to have you on our show. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.